Right, guys. I hope you're all doing well. Got back home to wherever you were going safely, and you're staying as sane and healthy during lockdown as possible. So, we're going to get back into our pre recorded version of the lectures today. So, what I'm going to be discussing today is going to be the first half of our content on human development. The first lecture, I'm going to largely focus on young childhood. Prenatal development, early infancy and childhood, and stopping just at around adolescence. And then next time we'll cover more adolescence, adulthood into older age. So, if we're talking developmental psychology, this is going to be any research framework in the field of psychology that's interested in the way that humans and non human animals change across time. Different eras of the lifespan see very different cognitive, perceptual, and social themes present. Um, we do sometimes think that in some ways people never really change. Well, that's not really true. We see lots of changes throughout the lifespan. The way that we change and develop is going to be very different when we're a tiny baby, when we're going through a lot of major changes, when we're an adolescent going through a lot of major changes, but even into adulthood things do change. Now, on the other hand, there are aspects about ourselves, things like personality traits, that can sometimes stay a little bit more stable. Developmental psychology is interested in understanding broadly what happens throughout the lifespan. So, some major themes, sorts of questions that get asked in the field of developmental psychology, many of them are going to be interested in this nature versus nurture distinction. So, nature and nurture, this is essentially the idea that some aspects of our psychological experience and our individual identity is going to be based on our genetic predispositions, things that we were born with, so our nature. Now, additionally, a lot of things that are true about us and ways that we change and evolve are going to be due to things in our environment. So, the way that we're raised, the experiences that we have throughout our lifetime. Uh, Historically, there have been conversations about nature versus nurture, like which one is more important, genetic predisposition versus environmental experiences. At this point, we know that the evidence strongly suggests that for every individual, a lot of the time it's going to be both. Yes, there are certain things that we do see the strength of genetic predisposition weighing pretty strongly, but it certainly appears to be the case that a lot of our identity is going to be a combination or an interaction between what our natural genetic predisposition is and the factors that life throws at us. So, a major theme throughout developmental psych is going to be understanding when it's genetics and when it's experiences. A fair amount of developmental research and theorizing has been interested in understanding how development occurs and the stages in which development occurs. So, we like to think about, let's say, when children are growing up, that there are very specific milestones that will be hit at specific months or years. And to a certain extent, sometimes that's true. To a certain extent, there are specific stages in humans and non human animals that we can expect to see. And at certain points, some changes that we experience can be somewhat abrupt. On the other hand, though, there's a fair amount of changes that happen throughout the lifespan that are a bit more continuous or gradual in nature. So, again, developmental psych is interested in when change will be more continuous versus when change happens a bit more abruptly. And additionally, as I mentioned, there are certainly some things that developmental psychologists have identified that are relatively stable throughout the lifetime, certain personality or temperamental characteristics that stay pretty consistent throughout the lifetime. But there are obviously lots of things about us that can change and adapt throughout the lifetime. So, identifying when will a certain aspect of our experience be stable, when will we see something that pops up in early childhood that is related or consistent with something that we see emerge in adulthood, versus when do people truly change. In terms of conducting developmental research, if we're interested in changes across the lifespan, this is obviously going to take a somewhat delicate or logistically taxing research approach, because if we're interested in change across time, we would need to have data collection across many different ages across the lifespan. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. One is going to be what we call a cross-sectional design. So a cross-sectional design is going to be data collection that takes place at a single period in time with people of many different ages. So this helps us get at this change across the lifespan piece, because if there's a developmental factor that's different in different age groups, right, we'll see that in the different groups present within our research study. Now, cross-sectional designs are they're going to have their benefits and their drawbacks. One benefit is that being able to conduct your data collection at a single point in time is just easier. It's less logistically taxing. It requires less time investment on the part of your participants, and it diminishes the likelihood that participants will drop out of your study. Limitations, though, would be that you couldn't necessarily rule out generational effects. So the fact that someone in your cross-sectional study grew up in the 50s versus another age group that grew up in the 2000s, one thing that distinguishes those two groups are going to be their age, but another is that they've had different experiences. Being part of a different generation leads you to have different experiences. So how much is it the progression of age versus how much is it being part of different groups that have experienced different things? So cross-sectional design is great, but it has that drawback. So longitudinal designs, on the other hand, are going to be any research design that takes place over an extended period of time. This can be weeks, this can be years, this can be decades. So the benefit is that you could have a specific group of individuals in your longitudinal study, and you can track that specific group over the course of the span of time. That's going to help you rule out things like different generational factors and experiences, since you're consistently collecting data from the same group of people. So, for example, research that's interested on bullying typically takes a developmental approach, because some developmental psychologists are interested in the role that the experience of being bullied or having peers be aggressive towards you has in shaping and changing psychological consequences in individuals. So the idea is you would want to identify bullying that might occur at an earlier point in time, and then see what the effects are years later among the individuals who were bullied. So that would be an example of a longitudinal design. The one that I've got depicted here was a study that took place over many, many years that did in fact find that children who were bullied more at an earlier time span did experience more anxiety and depression years later. So that would qualify as a longitudinal design. Now, again, the benefit is that you can see effects change throughout a specific group of individuals' lifetime, but it's a lot more of a taxing design. It takes more resources, it takes more effort, and it's harder to recruit people to be in a study that is going to go on for an extended period of time. So both cross-sectional, longitudinal have their upsides and downsides. Conversations about developmental stages. Some of these conversations have focused on how the stages are constructed throughout the lifespan in human development or non-human development. So this distinction I mentioned earlier of continuous versus stages, a related distinction that has been identified in this idea of critical periods versus sensitive periods for development. So the distinction here is subtle. A critical period is going to be any time period in which there is a strict time point cutoff during which a specific stimulus or change needs to occur for a certain development to occur. So the imprinting example that we read about in the text and that I'll reference again later. The idea being that for certain animals that do experience imprinting, that is to say that they become highly attached to the first large object or living thing that they see, as geese do, often becoming imprinted and very attached to their mother. This is something that has to happen during a very strictly defined period of time. Now, for humans and other more intelligent creatures, there's not going to be so many strictly defined critical periods during which there's a very, very specific time point at which you sort of lose your ability to develop. More so, if we're talking about human development, there's a series of what we call sensitive periods. So, the idea of sensitive periods during which, at various stages throughout childhood development, there are times when children are particularly receptive to or interested in certain things, has definitely received a fair amount of support. And it's even informed the popular educational Montessori approach that, for example, will target different sorts of artistic and expression sorts of opportunities for children depending on what sensitive period they're engaged in. So, another example of this that has a fair amount of support comes from a language phenomenon we learned about a few weeks ago. The idea is that children up to a certain age are a lot more receptive to learning a new language or learning multiple languages. So there's no strict cutoff at which children are incapable of picking up a second language, but up through the first early years of life and sort of tapering off around adolescence, children are much more able to easily pick up multiple or a second language. So that would more so qualify as a sensitive period as opposed to a critical period. There's no specific year or age at which children suddenly can't pick up a second language. It just sort of gradually diminishes over time. In terms of why we care about understanding developmental psychology, a lot of times the idea is that the more we understand about the way things change throughout the lifetime, the more we can identify factors or characteristics that help us make predictions about how people are going to end up later in life that can help us understand who will be successful, who will be happier. So, a fair amount of developmental research sometimes grapples with the nature of causality or the direction of causality. So, for example, there's a research phenomenon whereby children who smile wider in childhood tend to have more enduring marriages. It's the sort of thing where you can't necessarily know if the smiling causes someone to be a person who enters into a more enduring marriage, or if there's some other sort of a personality characteristic or developmental characteristic outside of those two variables that helps explain that relationship. But still, knowing that those two variables are related, the smiling and the enduring marriages, we can go some way towards understanding what variables tend to be related, and it can help us make predictions. So, a fair amount of research has been done on, for example, whether children's natural temperaments that they have early on in infancy or young childhood. So, temperament being sort of the natural personality type disposition that children tend to have, which does seem to be largely genetically or tends to largely be the result of genetics. There's a fair amount of research that there are things about the natural temperament that children have that can reliably seem to predict certain outcomes later in life. Now, in terms of talking more about developmental stages, so development in humans really starts to happen very shortly after conception. So you can see that the stages through which the embryo in utero develops, you see those changes start to occur pretty early on in pregnancy. So you do see those changes happen pretty fast. Now, it's not necessarily the case that children in utero are remembering things or necessarily learning in the same way that children or humans in other developmental stages would be, but there does seem to be an indication that there are certain stimuli that fetuses in the womb can start to experience and respond to. So, for example, fetuses in utero can respond to the sound of their mother's voice and start to learn to respond more to the sound of their mother's voice than to other stranger voices. So, it does appear to be the case that even in utero, children can start to at least experiencing the world. And the more and more they develop and the closer they get to being born, the more you can see certain habituation type learning start to take place. An understanding of the way that children develop before birth is quite important because there is a fair amount of research indicating that it's not necessarily going to be a risk free experience. There are things that can go awry during prenatal development that can impact developmental consequences later on once the child is born. So, research has identified a series or a class of what we call teratogens. So, this is going to be any agent that can reach the embryo or fetus during prenatal development and can cause any sort of damage to fetal development. So, this could be a chemical, this could be a virus. Most of us know that women are not meant to drink alcohol when they're pregnant because it could lead to what we call fetal alcohol syndrome. So, this is a condition that affects children in terms of the way that they present and the way that they look. And it also has a fair amount of consequences for children's emotional and intellectual development. So, based on the research on just how alcohol consumption interacts with prenatal development, we now know that the best advice to give pregnant women is to avoid alcohol. Another example from the news several years ago, the Zika virus. If you remember, this was a virus that was transmitted via mosquito bites. And it ended up being the case that actually one of the worst consequences of contracting the Zika virus was not necessarily the illness that adults would experience. It was that it had severe developmental consequences for babies that were born to women who were infected with Zika while they were pregnant. So it led to a lot of children being born with a birth defect that I know I'm going to mispronounce, microencephaly. But essentially, it's a defect that causes babies to be born with a much smaller brain matter, smaller amount of brain matter than normally would be developed. And this obviously has pretty severe consequences for their development and their health and well being long term. So, this I would say is topical at the present moment. We're all very scared of the coronavirus right now. And I would say that one of the sources of anxiety, one of the unknowns, is just how the coronavirus would impact prenatal development. So, it's just another thing that requires more research in the present moment is our understanding of just how the coronavirus would impact prenatal and fetal development, since we do know that viruses can often act as teratogens and impact prenatal development. Now, once children are born, they really start doing a lot of interesting behaviors basically right out the gate. They are pretty helpless. Human babies are more helpless than other sorts of animals that stand up and start walking and running within hours of being born. But the human newborn is a little bit more capable than you might initially think. They're born sort of preloaded with a series of natural reflexes and responses that all have different adaptive functions. So, children do have the reflex response, they will recoil, something like the startle response or the related Moro response, in which children will sort of, upon being thrown backwards or falling backwards, will sort of try and steady themselves. So that's the sort of thing that naturally helps children respond to experiences of falling. Or this rooting reflex, for example. This is the behavior that newborns exhibit, whereby an object near their mouths will cause them to naturally start doing a sucking motion. This is again an adaptive response because it helps babies successfully nurse so that they get the nutrition that they need. So, all of these reflex responses basically help a newborn right out the gate be more adaptive in their environment. In terms of the learning that babies can do, obviously they're pretty limited in terms of what they can do with language or any more advanced cognitive capability, but they can show habituation type responses. They can sort of get used to things. Again, this can even happen in utero, but babies can learn habituative type learning responses. They also show some pretty interesting preferences. For example, babies tend to much prefer stimuli that looks more like a human face. They have this natural disposition to be attracted to faces. And again, this might be an adaptive response because humans, being the pro social creatures that we are, being drawn to looking at other people and looking at their faces could be viewed as an adaptive pro social response. Brain development is something that definitely changes a lot throughout the lifespan. Babies are born with basically a giant tangled mess of brain cells that need a lot of pruning and shaping to become the more effective or efficient brain that older children and adults have. So when babies are born, they have more brain cells and connections than they ever will have again in their life. So, this isn't necessarily the case that they're smarter, right? It's just the case that they have more sort of unformed matter to do stuff with. So, it is true that you have more brain cells at birth than you will ever have in the rest of your life. It actually is the case that as children develop and become smarter and stronger and can do more things, it's the case that the brain is actually involved in what's called synaptic pruning. So, the process of growing and learning to use your brain more efficiently is going to be a process of reducing, getting rid of, cutting, or pruning unnecessary or extraneous synaptic connections. So, the process of the brain developing is going to be one whereby babies start with sort of all of the matter that they need to eventually develop an adult brain. And it's a process of through the months and the years just pruning the brain down into the more efficient machine that you see human adults have. Now, babies and young children tend to experience what we call infantile amnesia. So it is the case that most of the conscious or explicit memories of things that happened to us before about the age of 3 or 4 tend to be largely forgotten. So this may be due to the fact that certain brain areas like the hippocampus or the frontal lobe may not necessarily be sufficiently developed at those younger time periods to enable more explicit memories. Again, it's not the case that just because children aren't necessarily born with the capacity to create explicit memories, again, it doesn't mean that no learning can take place before language is developed and before explicit memory is developed. Children start to learn by using their bodies and by moving and by grasping and by just trying things out with their bodies and experimenting with motor functions. So babies can start to learn different associations. They can learn habituation. So there are certain things that babies are doing that helps shape their development that even though they're not perfectly competent and they need a lot of help early on in life, it's still a process of learning and trying things out and trial and error and eventually getting things right. Probably the most famous cognitive developmental psychologist of all time is the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Yes, I've been continuing my French lessons, but I still might have screwed that up. So, Dr. Piaget was famously very interested in the ways that children were unique and developed very differently than adults. There used to be the thought that children were essentially just smaller versions of adults. Now we know now that that's really not the case. Children are sort of fundamentally and characteristically different from adults, and they need to hit a series of developmental milestones in order to reach the stages of adulthood. So Piaget first developed a series of what he thought of as universal stages that the human child had to pass through. He conceptualized these as the sensory motor stage, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. These stages essentially take the human child from birth up to about a little pre-adolescence, about adolescence. He also conceptualized the idea that children throughout these stages are building schematic networks of knowledge and understanding, and that as they do that, they are at times engaging in what's called assimilation of information and at times in accommodation of understanding and information. So we've learned about schemas before. These are essentially our scripts or mental networks or networks of memory that help us understand the world. It's sort of how we organize memory and learning in a cognitive way. The idea is that children need to grow and develop the schemas that they have on different information and things that they encounter. They aren't necessarily born with full-fledged conceptual and categorized schemas for understanding the world. So Piaget suggested that the way children sort of grow their schemas is going to be at times assimilating new information into any pre-existing schemas that they have, but that at times when children eventually realize that the information that they used to have no longer appears applicable, will at times have a sort of a breakthrough, and they will accommodate new information and thus changing their schemas. So this is just the process of learning. As you try and develop your understanding of the world, sometimes you're going to be met with things that surprise you or that confuse you. And as children, the idea is that sometimes you're going to have information that conforms to your pre-existing growing schemas, but at times when you learn something different, eventually you will accommodate this new surprising information. So we're going to talk a little bit more and flesh out Piaget's theory just a little bit more. So this first sensory motor stage, so this birth through about 2 years of age. So this is the most basic stage when we're a baby, and the basic way that we have to learn about the world when we're a little tiny baby is just going to be observing. We have to start somewhere, and so we start acquiring our understanding of the world by looking around, by listening, by touching things, by putting things in our mouths. Just through this sort of perceptual experience, we're going to start to observe what appears to be true about our world, and that gives us something to start on. An interesting developmental marker that Piaget identified is so-called object permanence. So this is going to be something that the average child will develop at about 8 months old. So this is the idea that some children before 8 months will struggle to understand that objects continue to exist when you're not immediately looking at them. So this is a specific developmental milestone that it seems children at some point in this stage will eventually reach, and you're going to see their behavior change once they reach this stage. So I'll show you a couple videos, one in which a child younger than 8 months appears to fail at object permanence, and another one where a baby seems to have properly accomplished it. So starting with our failure of object permanence.
What do you have there? Is that your yummy giraffe? Let me see. Can I see? Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Where's that giraffe? Okay.
Okay, so as you can see, it appears that the baby, once the object went underneath the cloth, didn't go to look for it. The idea is that this seems to indicate that babies at the stage before object permanence occurs seem to have difficulty understanding that once they can't see something, it still continues to exist. Now, eventually, at some point, typically before the first year of age, or children hit their first birthday, you'll see them eventually succeeding at this same task.
Okay, now we're gonna try one. Two. Okay. Give me that. Okay. Well, okay. Now look. I'm gonna put it right here. Oh, okay. That was easy. Now let's try something harder. Okay, can you do that? Okay, watch. 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 Okay. Whoop. Whoop. Oh. Oh. How come it over there? Okay, I'm gonna try making it faster. Okay. Do. Whoop.
Okay, so the reason we would say that that baby succeeded at the object permanence task is because as soon as the object disappeared from view, he immediately went to go look for it. So we tend to see this change from not looking for an object that has just disappeared out of view to looking for the object that just went missing at, again, around 8 months. The next stage that Piaget conceptualized is what he called the pre-operational stage. So this is when children are beginning to be able to use language to express themselves, but they're still not going to be able to perform more complex or advanced logical operations. There are certain stages that you do see kids clear at various points within this pre-operational stage. So throughout this entire stage from 2 to about 7 years old, you see children start to become more advanced, be able to display more conceptual or abstract forms of thinking. So one stage, for example, that children pass through is what's called the egocentrism stage. So, egocentrism is when children have a limited capacity to reframe their perspective to think about something from someone else's point of view. So, a lack of understanding that other people are seeing something different than you might be seeing. Sort of thinking that the only perspective is your own, which is why it's called egocentrism. So kids start to be able to understand that people see and perceive something other than what they see and perceive, again, at around 6 years of age. Again, I'll reiterate that these stages that Piaget conceptualized, they're not so strict and critical as he might have thought. It's not necessarily the case that these stages happen abruptly. It sort of is a general sequence of advancements that children experience, but every child is on their own timeline just a little bit. So even if something like egocentrism resolving at around 6 years of age is average. If a kid is a little bit advanced or a little bit behind, it might be perfectly fine. So here's a video displaying what egocentrism would look like.
Can you tell me what you see when you look at that from where you're sitting? What are some of the things that you see?
A cat.
A cat.
And a tree and a barn.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. Can you tell me what you see when you look at it from that stool?
An owl.
An owl?
And him.
What is that?
A goat.
A goat?
Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else you see?
Yeah, right there.
Right there, what is that?
A tree.
A tree.
And that's another little tree.
Another little tree? Right. And can you tell me what I see when I look at this from where I'm sitting right here?
Owl.
Okay.
And a goat.
Mm-hmm.
And a little tree. And that. And that.
Okay, so can you tell me what you see from that side?
A fox and a bone and a volcano
Yeah.
and a rock and a big fat Christmas tree.
Now, Braxton, can you tell me what I see from where I'm sitting?
A bird and a river and a volcano and a horsey and a rock and a tree.
Okay, so the distinction between the two kids is that the first one seemed to basically assume that the perspective of the researcher was the same as his own perspective. When he was asked to think about what she saw, he couldn't mentally put together that she was now sitting from a different perspective. And he basically just repeated what it is that he was currently seeing when asked what she was seeing. Now, the slightly older kid, on the other hand, was able to think to himself and sort of spatially reframe what he was looking at to imagine things from the woman's point of view. And so he was able to say that she was seeing something different than what he was currently looking at. Theory of mind is going to be another developmental stage that tends to happen in this preoperational stage. So, theory of mind is going to be a cognitive development that's related to the resolution of egocentrism, but it's basically the idea that you begin to understand that other people are experiencing mental states besides your own. So, other people can be feeling and thinking and understanding something different than what you're thinking, feeling, and understanding. So children aren't naturally born with an understanding that other people have other perspectives and a whole unique, different mind. This is something that has to be developed and tends to emerge at around 4 to 5 years old. This principle of conservation, so basically the idea that children struggle with understanding the ways that quantities change and the way that numbers and amount of volume works, is something that they struggle with and eventually start to be able to do slightly more complex operations in understanding how different objects can conserve their quantity and their volume despite changing to a different shape. So again, let's watch a video to demonstrate how kids can sometimes struggle with being able to change quantity and numbers of things despite changing of shape.
So I'm going to make 2 rows of quarters. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
Because it's stretched out?
Yes.
Okay, so how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So, are there more in this row, or are they the same?
The same.
The same?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we have 2 sticks. Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? What about now? Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
That stick is longer.
The stick is longer?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because you moved to the oval.
So now it's longer.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me. I'm going to pour blue water into each of these cups, and you're going to have to tell me when they have the same amount, okay? Okay, tell me when this one's the same.
The same.
The same? Those 2 are the same now?
Yeah.
Okay. They're the same? Good.
The white is the same.
Good. Okay, now watch this. We're going to take the blue water from this glass, and we're going to pour it into this glass. Now, does this glass have more water? Does this glass have more water, or are they the same?
Has more water.
This one has more water? Can you tell me why?
Because that one's higher than that one.
That one's higher than that one. Right. Can you tell me, does this ball have more Play-Doh? Does this ball have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more?
Yeah.
Let's try and make them the same. Make them 2 of the same size. What about now?
They're the same.
They're the same now?
Yeah.
Okay, now watch. Now, does this one have more Play-Doh? Does this one have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more Play-Doh? Can you tell me why?
You smushed that one.
Because that one's smush. How about now? Does this one have more Play-Doh? Does this one have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
The same.
Now they're the same. Why are they the same?
You roll that one back up.
Okay, great. Okay. Did we share the graham crackers fair? Is this fair?
Yes.
Yes? Can you tell me why it's fair?
You have more than I do.
I have one.
You have two, and I have one.
Is that fair?
No.
No? How about now?
Now that's fair.
Now that's fair? Why is that fair?
You have two, and I have two.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea is that he struggled with understanding that despite the fact that, for example, that one cup was taller, it actually had the same exact amount of water as the other cup. Since it had been poured from another cup of the same size, someone of an older age would have been able to infer that the same amount of water was in both of the cups. Now, this demonstrates this assimilation versus accommodation process that children sometimes engage in. Likely a kid of that age, like in the video we just watched, is starting to grow an understanding that, for example, something that's bigger often has more of a quantity, a more basic understanding, but that often serves its purpose and is largely pretty accurate. The idea, though, is this ability of understanding conservation is going to be a more advanced understanding whereby you understand that just because one of the cups is taller doesn't mean it has more water. So eventually this process of learning that's going to happen, depending on if you're talking number conservation or volume conservation, that's going to happen at different ages. Accommodation is going to take place, right? Eventually, the child is going to learn that the more basic rule of that cup was taller, thereby it has more water, isn't always accurate. So, eventually, despite the fact that the simpler schemas help children start to understand the world, at a certain point, they're going to have to learn and adapt in order to be more accurate. So then moving on to the concrete operational stage that tends to happen between the years of 7 and 11. So this is when kids are starting to develop more advanced capabilities. So they can do mental operations that let them think a little bit more logically, and they can start to do simple math and that conservation property. The idea that you can start to understand that the quantity of something is not necessarily going to be derived by the shape of, let's say, the glass that something is in. So, this is going to be an age where kids are starting to do basic numerical and mathematical functioning. Okay, so once you reach the formal operational stage, which is 12 up into adulthood, so it's basically everything past 12 years of age, this is when we no longer have the limitations of childhood reasoning, whereby everything needs to be grounded in concrete examples and reality. We can do more advanced or abstract logical reasoning. So the idea is that we can start to think long term, we can make long term plans, we can do more complex mental operations, we can do more complex problems, we can solve more complex problems. So once children reach about 12 years of age, they tend to have the same sort of logical capacity that adults do. Now, that's not to say that someone who's 12 is the exact same cognitively or developmentally than someone who's an adult. We'll talk more about that next time. The idea that things still do change once you reach adolescence and into adulthood. Some points to make on Piaget's theory. So, again, he is for sure the most famous developmental psychologist who really did fundamentally change the way we think about childhood development. And there is a lot of support for the fact that these stages do tend to occur. That's not to say that Piaget's theory was perfectly accurate or that it hasn't received any refutations throughout the years. So, for example, Piaget thought that these stages could be more concretely defined in terms of when, in terms of years, they would happen. It appears to be the case that normal development doesn't necessarily happen in the same timeline for everyone. Okay, so additionally, there have been some refutations to his research. For example, the way he would do research with kids was to ask them to verbalize their answers to different questions. And it might be the case that a flaw with Piaget's work was that despite the fact that children might not have the language capacity to properly explain their thinking, it might be the case that they're maybe a little bit smarter than Piaget's research might indicate. So, Despite the fact that there's limitations to Piaget's theory, over the course of time, it does appear to be largely accurate, and it has continued to be a well-supported framework for how children develop. One thing that's relevant in this conversation on developmental stages is autism spectrum disorder. So, this is a condition that gets talked about a fair amount in the media. And this is basically a disorder in which we see various stages of development either happening at a delay or not happening entirely. So, this is going to be a disorder that largely you're going to see impairment in theory of mind, so a limited capacity for thinking from other people's points of views, certain repetitive behaviors that one might need to engage in to self-soothe or comfort yourself, or difficulties in social interactions. So, autism spectrum disorder is so called because we now have an understanding that there is a sort of a broad range of functioning that exists on this entire spectrum. So, it ranges from the most severe cases where one is possibly not verbal or can't take care of themselves to more mild cases, often termed Asperger's syndrome, in which someone might just have some mild social impairment but otherwise can exist normally with limited deficiencies. So, in terms of the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, it definitely is the case that the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder has advanced quite a bit in the previous decade. So, some people say that rates of autism have themselves increased. In my opinion, it's more likely the case that our diagnostic tools are just more sensitive. So, yes, there are more diagnoses, but not necessarily the case that rates of autism are exploding or increasing. It's just that we're better able to pick up on the markers of autism spectrum disorder. And it is definitely the case that some of what you've heard about autism is true, that in some cases, despite the trade offs with certain social impairments or difficulties, often autism spectrum disorder can be associated with indications of intelligence or a high level of talent in certain areas. So, it's an interesting disorder because it does get talked about so much, and it is inherently a disorder that gets researched quite a bit within a developmental framework, because it does certainly appear to be the case that there are certain developmental markers that are either missed or happening at a different stage that tends to signal that an individual might have ASD. So, a few more points on childhood development. Um, Social development is going to be the idea that children are going to develop into social creatures based on their earlier experiences with the people that they're around when they're younger. So, their experience with caregivers, largely when they're young, is going to, in a lot of ways, shape the way that they grow and how they grow socially and the sorts of relationships that they have throughout the course of their lifetime. So, one thing that's definitely true about adaptive social development in infants, one is going to be this idea of infant attachment. So, infants and children tend to create strong emotional ties with another person. Typically, it's going to be a caregiver, mother and or father. It is certainly the case that children's attachment to their caregivers at a certain level is about fulfilling biological needs, getting food and resources. But it also appears to be the case that children and infants, both humans and non human animals alike, have this desire for attachment and comfort from their caregivers that goes beyond just needing resources from them. A famous example of an experiment that looked into the importance of comfort or contact from a caregiver was the famous Dr. Harry Harlow monkey studies, in which he evaluated whether monkeys, non human animals, had this drive for physical comfort from a caregiver.
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother. Now here are 106's two mothers. As you can see, it was weaned on a wire mother. Here's baby 106. Watch. He's going to the wire mother. Stop to eat the little. Oh, he's going back. He's back on the cloth mother, and he'll stay on the cloth mother. Actually, this baby spends from 17 to 18 hours a day on the cloth mother and less than 1 hour a day on the wire mother. We had predicted that the variable of contact comfort would be a variable of measurable importance, but we are unprepared to find that it completely overwhelmed and overshadowed all other variables, including those of nursing.
Frankly, Doctor, if it comes to a choice between wire and cloth, it's reasonable to expect that any child will go to the cloth. It's a matter of creature comfort, like a baby with its blanket. But is this really love?
Well, what do you mean by saying that a baby loves its mother? Certainly one thing we mean is that it gets a great feeling of security in the presence of the mother. Now, Mr. Collingwood, wouldn't you say that if you frightened a baby, then it went running to its mother, was comforted, and then all the fear disappeared and was replaced by a complete sense of security that that baby loved its mother?
An interesting philosophical point raised there, the idea that is this sort of natural physical attachment that babies have to their caregivers love? I would say I sort of agree with Harry Harlow that it seems like love, it feels like love, seems like it. Either way, it appears that there is this intense need that children and infants have to have this close contact comfort with a caregiver. Typically, it's going to be a mother or father, but as long as a child has a caregiver with whom they can get physical affection, hugs, and attachment, it appears that it's very important for adaptive development down the line. Children need some source of familiarity, some things in their life that appears to be a source of constancy. Being in unpredictable environments where things are constantly changing. This is another thing that is important for children's adaptive and healthy social development. So, having some structure, having people that the children can count on seeing every day, this is another factor that's important in well adjusted development. So, this process of imprinting that I alluded to earlier, this is something that really uniquely happens in certain animals like geese and some birds. So this is when the attachment process happens by the first animal that the infant bird sees being strongly associated as their mother figure. So it could be the case that imprinting in geese is typically going to have them imprinting upon their mother, but other research has found that these geese can imprint on humans or just random objects. So, despite the fact that there's this imprinting correlate that exists in some animals, this really doesn't happen the same way in animals like humans and those that we're more closely related to. It is definitely the case that there are certain people that children become attached to, again, likely their caregivers, often their parents, and that having those caregivers around to provide familiarity and comfort is, again, important for children's well adjusted social development. Interesting research on the way that children developed socially has uncovered that there appears to be a distinction in what we call attachment styles that children can display. So, attachment style is basically going to be the way that children respond to people in their environment and, in particular, their caregivers. So, the source of attachment style, research indicates that it might have a genetic component. Likely, there's a genetic predisposition at play, but it's likely also the case that there's something about the environment that children are raised in that helps determine their attachment style. So, most children, this sort of depends culture to culture, but by and large, most children grow into what's called a secure attachment style. So, this is when children are definitely attached to their caregiver, but in a novel environment, as long as the caregiver is there, the child feels sort of free to explore independently and they're willing to go into novel environments and explore. They do become distressed if their caregiver leaves when they're in a novel room, but when the caregiver comes back, the child is happy to see them and once they've been comforted can go back to independent play. Some children grow into one of the insecure attachment styles, so either anxious or avoidantly attached. So this is going to have different attachment styles that tend to be associated with poor long-term social consequences and poor development. So an anxious attachment, for example, is going to be when a child is a lot more anxiety prone, tends to be very attached to their caregiver, gets a lot more distressed when they come back. And when the parent returns to the room, they tend to have a sort of a hot and cold response. They like cry and cling, but then may also turn away. So that's a bit more the style of this anxious attachment type. Avoidant is going to be when the child is basically not particularly interested in the caregiver whatsoever, sort of doesn't look to them for comfort, doesn't necessarily care when the caregiver comes back. So both of these styles would be termed insecure attachment, both anxious and avoidant, and both of them are less ideal attachment styles that don't tend to bode as well for long-term social and relationship development as secure attachment styles. There is some indication that the early relationships that children forge do at a certain level provide the model for the way people have relationships down the line when they're adults, both peer relationships as well as romantic relationships. You do tend to see that children who grow into one of these three attachment styles of secure, anxious, and avoidant, you do tend to see those patterns repeat themselves throughout the lifetime. Again, people can change, people can receive therapy, people can grow, but you do sort of tend to see early relationships and attachment styles provide a bit of the mold that children have for being in relationships later in life. One research paradigm that's attempted to show how these different attachment styles lead to different responses that children have to the environment is the so-called strange situation experiment. So this is basically a research paradigm that seeks to understand how children respond to the presence versus absence of a caregiver when they're in a slightly strange and novel situation.
But can the essential elements of home life be translated into a standard laboratory setting for controlled scientific study? After conducting extensive observations of parents and children at home, a student of Bowlby's, Mary Ainsworth, devised such a procedure, called the strange situation, which places the child under some stress. It has become the most widely used, standardized way to assess the quality of a child's attachment to their caregiver. Here the researchers are recording how 14-month-old Lisa responds in this attractive but unfamiliar setting. How will she react to a stranger? What will happen when her mother leaves the room? And when she returns? It's Lisa's behavior when her mother returns, what psychologists call the reunion, that they are particularly interested in.
Most importantly is to look for the type of balance that a child strikes between an attachment need and, on the other hand, to explore the play material.
Once Lisa has settled down to play, a stranger enters the room and sits in the chair reading a magazine. After a couple of minutes, the stranger attempts to interact with Lisa. Soon after, Lisbeth gets a cue to leave the room. The stranger tries to comfort Lisa, but in vain. Lisbeth comes back into the room and the camera records how Lisa reacts. Now the first part of the procedure is over, and Lisbeth settles Lisa down again. The stranger leaves them alone together. And soon after, Lisbeth goes too. Lisa is on her own. Her distress is plain to see. Once again, the efforts of the stranger to console Lisa are to no avail. But Lisbeth manages to calm her almost at once, and shortly afterwards the observation ends. Lisa showed outward signs of what's called secure attachment.
Okay, so the reason that infant displayed what's called secure attachment is because the child was comfortable exploring the environment on her own as long as her mother was there as a sort of a source of support, even if she wasn't actively soliciting the support. So this is the mark of a child who can comfortably explore new environments as long as they feel like they do have the security of the caregiver there in case they need it. So this is going to be indicative of a more secure attachment style. A more anxiously attached child upon the reunion would likely be a little bit more hot and cold. They may want to cling to their caregiver but may turn their face away. And again, avoidant, on the other hand, is probably not going to be particularly distressed when the caregiver leaves or returns. Again, we see secure attachment being the most associated with positive developmental outcomes. So, as this would allude to, the impact that caregiving has on children is obviously quite powerful. So, different parenting styles and techniques can go a long way in shaping just how well adjusted an infant and ultimately a child is going to be. So, there definitely does seem to be some genetic component in terms of what sort of attachment style an infant and a child will develop. But it is also the case that parents can use certain child rearing techniques that can provide a more safe or secure model that can help put them on the path towards well adjusted development and healthier adult relationships. So I know your book mentioned the authoritarian versus permissive versus authoritative parenting, the distinction between parenting that is dogmatic and harsh or completely permissive with little to no discipline, to authoritative, where you tend to see some secure boundaries, but with the parent making some concessions for the child to be independent. That last, authoritative parenting style, does seem to be, based on the research, a style that can help children develop into more securely attached children that are comfortable navigating new environments, but still do feel secure that their caregivers will be there for them and will support them and will love them. Again, using those sorts of parenting techniques can help shape the attachment style that children display. And again, this can help provide the model that often you'll see repeat itself when eventually the child grows up into adult and forges new relationships in their life. The importance of having this sort of positive modeling in parenting and the opportunity to have comfort from your caregiver and develop appropriate attachment and to be comforted is, again, of the utmost importance for children to develop into healthy, psychologically well adjusted adults. So, an unfortunate and tragic natural experiment that displayed just how damaging lack of attachment can be is this example of the children that came out of Romanian orphanages at the end of the 1980s. So, with the fall of the Soviet Union, there came to be a lot more awareness of the conditions in certain Soviet bloc countries. And additionally, it was the case in Romania at the time that a lack of availability to birth control caused a abundance of births among parents that couldn't care for children. And so Romanian orphanages became an unfortunate place where a lot of children were placed in environments where they had very little caregiver attachment or affection. And what came out of the Romanian orphanages was an indication that having this deprivation of attachment early in life can lead to certain consequences down the line. Now, it is the case that children are typically resilient and can recover in many ways from abusive pasts, but it's definitely not always easy. It takes a lot of work to repair yourself psychologically from an abusive past. And it is certainly the case that there are certain experiences that can traumatize children irrevocably. So before we sign off for the day, we'll watch one last video on the Romanian orphanages of the 1980s.
So in 1989, communism fell, and the world went to Romania to cover the fall of Ceausescu. There were some medias that actually found institutions that were never meant to be discovered by the public or the outside world. It left the world in shock that such conditions even existed.
Those of us who visited these institutions built by the communist regime are unlikely ever to forget them. Hundreds of children not so much cared for as contained.
Well, at the age of 6 months old, I became ill, and my parents took me to a hospital to be treated for my illness. But instead of finding healing at a hospital, I actually ended up being infected with polio. My parents took me to a different hospital in Sighetu Marmația. They never came back. So the state put me in an institution for handicapped children, an orphanage known as Home Hospital for the Irrecoverable Children.
What's in this room, no one could prepare for. Filthy, dark and stinking. There's excrement everywhere. These boys are the most difficult cases. They deserve the best of care. Instead, they get the worst.
From the moment that we could remember for ourselves, that's all we knew. We didn't have compassion. We didn't have feelings or emotions. We just existed to just vegetate, We were just wild animals that needed to be caged up, is what we were considered pretty much. I grew up there up until I was 11 years old.
Romania has precious little that the world wants except its children. These are the children soon to start a new life far from their real parents. Some orphanages have been emptied already.
I was adopted by a family in Southern California in San Diego, Marlis and Daniel Rocco. It was difficult pretty quickly, actually. I could not adapt into a family environment. My mind was just so used to living in the institution, I was desperate to go back to Romania. I got angry. I became super bitter. I even wrote letters asking the workers if they would let me stay with them till I was 18 years old. Each and every single one of them said no. I went back to Romania in 2001. I went to meet my birth family to search for answers. We also went back to the institution where I grew up. I tried to understand my mom. I tried to get to know her, but unfortunately, not every parent wants to be a parent. If I had never come to America, I would either be on the streets or absolutely dead. There's so many kids who are just kicked out of this, who are kicked out of the system. Every city I went into Romania, or every county, when you see a grown adult sitting or standing, rocking back and forth, or doing something that only an institutionalized person would do, you can instantly recognize that person grew up in an orphanage. I do miss the institution sometimes, and people don't understand that because they've never experienced it. It's where we're used to. That's where we grew up. It's our home.
So this is a obviously tragic example that illustrates, among many things, the societal consequences that could occur um, in in this case the country of Romania, where the dictator Sokoso outlawed birth control. The unanticipated societal consequence of all of these children being put into these institutions where they did not have the love and care that they needed to develop properly and with as much health and well being as possible. Those sorts of unanticipated consequences on the healthy development of children is the sort of thing that public policy should hopefully be aware of. So I'm going to leave that here. I think this video went a little bit long, so I'll make the one for the next part of development a little bit shorter. But I'm going to leave it there for today. I hope you guys are having a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.